All right, hello everyone. We're doing something a little different today. So, for the past months, people have been asking me to do a video on the Genesis flood. I have gotten several emails about this for such a long time, about the Genesis flood. When are you going to do a video on this? When is this going to come up? Now, I do have one planned in the future as part of like a series on Genesis chapters 1 through 10. I want to go through each chapter, do a video on each, kind of looking at everything going on in there. However, I don't expect to actually do that for a year. However, about a few months ago, I emailed one of my favorite scholars, John Walton, to ask him a couple things about the research I was doing on Genesis. And I just kind of asked him, hey, do you have any good books here on, you have any good books on the flood you could recommend? And he said, well, yeah, mine. He said, so I was like, well, I didn't know you had one. And he said, well, it's going to come out in April. So that got me excited because a lot of people have been asking about a lot of this. Sort of like a video or a good book to understand the flood in its ancient Near Eastern context. And I've read a lot of John Walton's books in the past. I have his application commentary. I have his book of a survey of the Old Testament. All of his entire Lost World series. And as I said, he's one of my favorite scholars. So when I heard about this, I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to bring him on the channel to talk about the book, talk about some of the things he's done in his research regarding the flood and what's going on in Genesis and whatnot. So today I have with me here Dr. Walton through Skype to talk about his book that's coming out today called The Lost World of the Flood. He co-authored it with another scholar named Tremper Longman III. And I got the book a couple weeks ago and I found it absolutely phenomenal. I read through it pretty quickly in about the course of a week because I thought it was just exceptional. Covers a lot of things about the Genesis flood, a lot of things we tend to misunderstand when we read it from Western eyes or from a Western background. So I have Dr. Walton with me. Dr. Walton, how are you doing today? Welcome to the channel. Thanks for coming on.
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm excited to talk about the book.
Awesome. Yeah, this is a great book. I really did thoroughly enjoy reading it. And so I wanted to talk to you basically, like, what was basically the motivation for your in this series doing a book specifically on the flood, and what brought you to this idea that we should have a video about the flood narrative in Genesis? And then you can also go into why the flood narrative is even in Genesis.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was like the other lost books. There's an issue that's of great interest today that's often an issue of controversy or confusion. And Tremper Longman and I decided that it was worth putting a book out on it just to help try to lead readers to know how to read the biblical account of the flood in its ancient Near Eastern context, according to the genre in which it's in, just like we've done on the other Lost World books. A contemporary problem where reading in light of genre and ancient Near East can make a difference. And one of the first things is to try to figure out what's the flood narrative doing in Genesis. How is that working? And one of the main things that we pointed out, and we're not the first ones to point it out, was that the flood narrative works as sort of a recreation narrative. You have some of the same patterns as in the creation narrative. So we get to the point where water covers everything, just like in Genesis 1, verse 2. And then dry land emerges, and the animals come forth, and the humans come forth, and there's blessing, and all of those issues. So from a literary standpoint, it's clear that they are reiterating creation. And that's important for the interpretation of it. For all of that, we need to understand what is the basic element in creation. And of course, in my previous Lost World books, I talked about how important establishing order is for understanding creation in the ancient world. And so in the flood narrative, we have the idea that order has been disrupted by all the violence, and so God brings about non-order as waters cover the land, and then order re-emerges. In a sense, a recreation act.
Excellent. Yeah, I did notice that in the book. You did kind of go over how it's sort of like a retelling of creation, sort of like almost like a do-over is kind of what's going on in there. So going on that, why would it be written sort of like a retelling of creation? Why would they do that from your scholarly standpoint? What would you think is the best explanation for why they're doing that?
Well, because the issue of order and what brings order and what disrupts order is one of the main themes of Genesis. It starts in Genesis 1. Of course, Genesis 3 picks up the disruption of order when they eat from the fruit. They wanted to build order around themselves because wisdom is connected to order. And so in this regard, this is what Genesis is doing and why they want to talk about the flood. Remember that the flood narrative is not to give the readers information that they didn't know before about the existence of an event. The Genesis book wasn't trying to say, hey, by the way, did you know that there was a flood one time? Everybody knows there was a flood. And so they're not trying to convey the information about the event. What's important is that they want to interpret the event. And of course, that's what the Bible provides for us. It provides interpretation of events, interpretation of what people do, interpretation about what God is up to. And so in that sense, the narrator includes it because he wants to talk about this very important event that everybody knows about and weave that into the pattern about God's seeking order and establishing order and things that disrupt order. Eventually, this is part of the backstory of the covenant, and the covenant is going to be God's way of establishing order.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I thought it also paralleled nicely with your book, Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament, where you noted that ancient authors were not doing what modern historians were doing, which is they're just trying to tell history. It's that everyone in these high-context societies understood these events, and they were more interested in sort of like the theological outcomes of what these events were telling us. So it wasn't...
Exactly.
Yeah, so it wasn't...
By the way, your readers should know that a new revised edition of Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament is coming out next month.
Oh, really? That should be exciting. Awesome. Yeah, I've read that book, Ancient Near Eastern Thought, by you, I think about 6 months ago, and it's another great book. I really enjoyed that. So going on that, I want to take a short little sidetrack. Everyone, when people found out I was going to interview you about your book, everyone wanted me to ask you about the first 4 verses of Genesis 6, because there is so much controversy around these simple 4 verses just kind of put in Genesis, which almost kind of reads like sort of like a prelude to the flood narrative. Everyone wants to know who the Nephilim are. I can't tell you how many videos on YouTube there are just devoted to these strange theories about the Nephilim being aliens or all these other really weird views. You don't talk about it as much. You have a chapter on it in this book, which is good. You talk more about it in your application commentary. Could you just kind of give us a rough idea of what's going on with this prelude to the flood? Who are the Nephilim? Who are the sons of God? What's going on in this short little section here?
Well, again, we have to read it in light of the ancient world instead of trying to read modern stuff into it. And so that's what we need to do. We need to understand how this reflects something going on in the ancient world. We do spend a chapter on it, and that's updated considerably from when I wrote the commentary, which was now almost 20 years ago. So the question of who they are, we find that there's a lot of interesting insight given to that by reading some of the intertestamental literature like the Book of Enoch. Mm-hmm. Not a biblical book, but a Jewish book written about the 3rd century BC. And there they talk about this group that they call the Watchers. And the Watchers, clearly in the context of Enoch, are the sons of God from Genesis 6. Also in the context, clearly, the Watchers connect to a group known in Babylon as the Apkallu. Since Enoch is connecting both of those groups, the Apkallu and the sons of God, that gives us reason to try to interpret the sons of God in light of the Apkallu. The Apkallu are ones who come from the gods in order to bring civilization to humanity. But they end up corrupting humanity. What we find in Genesis 6 is that the way it introduces the sons of God, it introduces them as when people began to multiply on the face of the earth. That's not just before the flood. That takes you all the way back to the time of Seth and Cain. And therefore the sons of God, those very vague 4 verses, describes that whole period of time between Seth and Noah. That describes that whole period. And the sons of God, again, we connect them to the Apkallu. That doesn't help us give a metaphysical identification. It helps us get a literary insight, okay? But metaphysically, we can't really say. The Nephilim are there in that time, but there's no reason to think of the Nephilim as anything but the heroes of old. That's how it describes them, the great heroes in verse 4. So, whether the Nephilim are kings or divine council members, other times when the Old Testament uses sons of God, they're divine council members. That would fit with the Apkallu, but again, it's very difficult to assess the metaphysical nature of it. All we can do is talk about them literarily.
Yeah, I always found that interesting, especially when I read your application commentary. It just sort of hit me like the Nephilim are just called heroes. It's really interesting that people try to read so much into those just short little verses, and it's just there's not enough information there to really go on what it's really saying. But do you think this is sort of like a prelude to the flood leading into that?
Well, the whole period is a prelude into the flood. Again, most people have read the sons of God in Genesis 6 as somehow that this happens just before the flood. Mm-hmm. And then they ask the question whether this caused the flood. Once you shift your understanding and say, oh, this just describes the entire period from Seth to Noah, it's not so much something the sons of God did that caused the flood. It's rather what the sons of God did that caused the steady downturn of civilization all the way across those eras and leads up to the situation where there's nothing but violence. Theoretically, having some representatives from the gods, whoever they are, kings or divine council members, having representatives from the gods should be at least a quasi-divine presence and bring order. But in fact, we find out differently. Even if it's a quasi-divine presence, it does not bring order. It rather ends up resulting in disruption of order. So they're not the cause of the flood, but they describe that whole period between Seth and Seth and Noah.
Yeah, I thought when you went over that in the book, The Lost World of the Flood, that was really interesting. I never really thought of that. You know, as typical Westerner, you sort of just read that as sort of like, well, this was happening right before the flood. But really, they're trying to describe everything that was going on between Adam to Noah. And I thought that was an interesting take on that. So, moving on into the flood itself, it's pretty clear that this is sort of described in global catastrophic measures. So, now, a lot of people think, well, it must be a global flood because it describes it as a global flood. But is that really what's going on in the ancient Near Eastern world, where they describe these things as sort of global? What is your take on this as being sort of written in sort of like a global catastrophic event, and what in regards to your research on this?
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to read it the way we read other Old Testament passages. That's part of the genre. And we have this kind of universalistic language that occurs frequently in the Old Testament. For example, in Zephaniah 1, verse 2, I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will sweep away men and beasts and birds in the sky, fish in the sea, and the idols that cause them to stumble, when I destroy all mankind from the face of the earth. But then it goes on in Zephaniah, and it's clear that he's talking about the destruction of Babylon, destruction by Babylon on Judah. So it's clearly described in universalistic terms, but it also clearly isn't universal. We get the same kind of thing in Lamentations 2, in verse 22. It talks about, let me see, 2:22. It says, as you summoned to a feast day, you summoned against me terrors on every side. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. Do you hear it? No one escaped or survived. But this is the fall of Judah. And we know that people went into exile. People did escape and survive. So we find that the biblical text uses universal language to describe huge cataclysms, disasters. So they use that language, but that doesn't mean they actually believe that it was universal in scope. We read texts like Genesis 41:57, where it says, all the world came to Joseph for food. That sounds pretty universal. Are you going to read that literally? Well, if so, you've got to figure out how the Eskimos made it across the Atlantic and not starved to death on the process. And all of them, not just representatives, because all the world came to Joseph for food. So we just have to be sensible about understanding how text works and how this language works. So we use the Bible's own rhetoric to demonstrate that universalistic language does not always pertain to a universal scope.
Yeah, I always found that interesting, that there's a lot of people I've talked to online, they come on my channel, atheist, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whoever, who tend to want to pick and choose sometimes. Like, clearly Joseph was being metaphorical, but when it comes to the flood, it has to be literal. And it's like, well, let's try to understand it in the context it was written in. They seem to be using these sort of hyperbole, this sort of just, universal language. You also see that in a lot of the eschatology of the Bible, specifically passages like you mentioned with the destruction of Jerusalem and whatnot. And you see that in the New Testament as well. I mean, Matthew says that all the sick were coming out to Jesus. Well, we don't believe everyone was coming out to Jesus. It was just a large number of people. So that's clearly a reoccurring theme in there. And I thought it was really good that you covered that in the book. But going on that point, a lot of skeptics, people that aren't Christians, or even young earth creationists, will say that this threatens the validity of Scripture if it's using hyperbole. It has to be literal. Because if we start saying this is hyperbole, well then why is the resurrection not hyperbole? Why is other things not hyperbole? Doesn't this lead to some sort of just picking and choosing with regards to Scripture, what is hyperbole and what isn't?
And that's a valid point to raise, but of course we have methods in place to try to prevent that kind of misjudgment. As you can tell, I just demonstrated the use of universal language when describing major catastrophes. That's also true in the ancient Near East. They use universal language for major catastrophes, whether it's warfare or natural catastrophe. So we've demonstrated that legitimate use of rhetoric by showing other examples which are clearly legitimate use of rhetoric. So that's not the same as saying anything you want can be metaphorical. This is a established form of rhetorical language in the Old Testament, and it even carries, as you said, into the New Testament. So there are methodological controls on that. We're trying to read it the way the author intended it, not just kind of make something metaphorical because we want it to be.
Yeah, it's really kind of funny to me. A couple months ago, I was on an atheist podcast called Dogma Debates, and the host, David Smalley, said this exact same thing, and I basically just told him what you told me. We got to read it in its actual context. This idea of a slippery slope, that just because some parts are hyperbole, some parts are not, does not mean the whole thing is. I like to use the example of John 15:1. Do we believe Jesus really is a vine? Because he said, I am the true vine. No. We understand, like if we were going to read the Hamlet, we understand there's metaphors, but we also understand the basic general story. We let the text speak for itself. And that's why I always tend to recommend your books, because I think you do a good job of pointing that out. So I just want to ask you just a few more questions about this. I don't want to give away too much is in the book, because I want people to actually go purchase it, read it. It's a great book. It covers a lot of different things. But one part in the book, you do point out there is a historical event behind the flood. This is not something they just made up. Could you talk about what this historical event is and why you think this best is the actual event that the flood was based upon?
Well, they wouldn't be telling you about it if there wasn't an event. You don't make up an interpretation for an event that never happened. You give an interpretation of the event that people are wondering about. I mean, just like today, these days, there are all kinds of interpretations of, why did God allow the Holocaust to happen? And different people have different interpretations. But you wouldn't bother trying to interpret it if it never happened. Okay, so with the flood, there's the assumption, and it's throughout the ancient world, that there was such a thing. The question is, how could there be such a thing? Why would the gods do it? So again, there's no reason to make up an event just so you can interpret it. That makes no sense whatsoever. So there is some sort of historical event behind the flood. The point we make is, too often Christians reading the Bible feel like they need to reconstruct the event so that it can be considered true. We don't have to reconstruct the event. We can't reconstruct the event. And there's no need to. The text isn't trying to prove there was a flood. The text assumes there was a flood, and it's trying to interpret that event. The authority of Scripture is not in the event or any way that we could reconstruct it. The authority of Scripture is in the interpretation of the event, because that's what the text is doing, and that's what carries authority. We adopt and accept the interpretation of the event, whatever its actual historical range or scope may have been.
Right, and I think that's a great point. And I also, for anyone who gets the book, Dr. Walton also actually mentions a flood event happening several thousand years ago that is probably the most likely historical event behind the flood. So if you get a chance to pick up the book, you will hear about this. So it's not like they just made it up, and I think that's a great point you made. And people, they didn't just make up events, they would try to give us their theological views about the event. So this idea that just because there's hyperbole or things are being described theologically in the Bible, that does not mean that it's all myth. Because a lot of scholars and a lot of laymen just assume that all this was just sort of made up. How do you, just real quick, how do you respond to other scholars? Like I was listening to some lectures by Christine Hayes from Yale University, and she thinks Abraham was made up. She thinks Isaac and Jacob never existed. How do you respond to people who say those sort of things, that this was just a myth made up that never really happened?
Well, I don't really see ancient Near Eastern literature making up people and then suggesting they're historical. I mean, human beings, not the gods here or anything like that, but I just don't see a lot of ancient literature that is involved in making people up. They're talking about people that they believe existed. Now, you can argue with whether they really existed or not, but they believe they existed, and so they're not making them up. I respect some of the work that Christine Hayes does, but if that's what she's saying, I'm afraid I would disagree. I would feel like that was an overreaction.
Yeah, and I kind of felt the same way, too. It really seems like the biblical authors really thought these people existed, and there most likely is at least an historical person behind it. We can talk about the nature of the events, whether they're true or not, whether they're embellished or whatnot, but they at least accepted that these events and these people actually did exist, and they weren't writing fiction. They thought what they were writing actually did happen. So is that a good way you would sort of describe it?
I think that's what I would assume. I mean, I've got no reason to think that they did not exist. It's not like they are inauthentic for their time period, or that they're. I mean, you read the Greek myths, and then you find people doing really crazy things that you say that's just unbelievable. But that's not the case with even the ancestor narratives or things of that sort. So I think we have to be careful readers, nuanced readers. It's okay to read critically, but that doesn't mean we adopt a skeptical stance.
Right. I think that's a great point. I mean, we cannot just make these sweeping views that a lot of skeptics do, that, well, this Greek myth is clearly myth, therefore everything from the ancient world must be a myth because it's written in the same period. I mean, we have to go text by text. We have to look at these things, look at the internal markers, external context, language, whatnot. And I think that's one thing I love about your books is you really get into them. You look at the ancient Hebrew words. It's one of my favorite things you did in The Lost World of Adam and Eve is you looked at the actual words for like rib and dust and how these were used. And that blew my mind when you went through that. So getting back to the flood, okay, if something like this happened, if a flood event really did happen, so then a common argument we hear from a lot of people who think this flood had to be literally global, it had to cover every world, is why didn't God just tell Noah to move? Why bring animals on board? What's the theological point behind bringing these animals, two of every kind, on the ark?
Well, the idea in the text is that God is preserving order. And so the animals are part of the ordered world. You read the Mesopotamian accounts, and they bring all sorts of craftsmen and specialists on board because they're preserving civilization. In the biblical account, there's a preservation of order, and animals are part of that world, so that they're brought onto the boat. We don't really, people don't balk at this, but in the book we claim we really don't know the size of the ark. Mm-hmm. We believe the numbers that are there are rhetorical in nature, not actual, and we give lots of reasons for that. So we really don't know the size of the ark. We don't really need to believe that he brought every sort of animal from all over the world onto the ark. Again, we've made assumptions about those things based on some of the hyperbolic language that's there. So he brings animals on board because that's part of preserving the order that God created in the world.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and I also have when you sort of like look at the text, I think one of the things I've responded in the past regarding this is the historical event behind the flood. We're told the world was just full of wickedness, and if Noah's meant to sort of preserve order, like you talk about in this book, sort of preserve the animals, it'd be really hard for him to just move across this evil, desolate place with all these animals. It might actually would make more sense for him to build a sanctuary for them that he could then move when the water comes in. And I thought when you talk about the theological understanding of preserving order in that kind of fit with that idea behind the historical event of the flood. And so I thought that was really kind of good. One final question I want to ask you about this, the flood in general. There are other ancient Near Eastern flood accounts, and you talk about this a little bit in the book. Does this somehow threaten the biblical account? Because some have argued that the Jews just copied. They just copied a flood account from the Mesopotamians, changed some things. It's not really what happened. They just read about it somewhere, and they were just stealing from the culture around them. How would you respond? You kind of go over this in the book, but how would you respond to that?
Well, if they really read the accounts carefully, they wouldn't at all be inclined to say that Israel's just borrowing the account. Remember, nobody has to borrow the fact that an event happened. Everybody knows that the event happened. They all agree that there was a flood of some sort, and the Israelites didn't just learn that from Babylonians when they went into exile. They believed that a flood took place. What distinguishes the Israelite account from any other account is the interpretation of the flood. That's the most important part. We would call that the authoritative part, and that's the part that is most different from any other account that we see. So the idea that they borrowed the account makes it sound like they didn't even know anything about a flood until somehow they learned it from the Babylonians. There's no reason to think that. So they're writing about an event that everybody believes happened, and they're interpreting the event. And again, the interpretation is nothing like the Babylonian account. I likewise don't believe that they are giving their interpretation to argue against the Babylonians. They're just giving their interpretation because they think it's true. And so that's why they say what they say about it.
Yeah, I think it's really, you point out in the book that just because they come from the same culture doesn't mean someone stole it. For the very same reason, just because we have a constitution, French nation has a constitution, that doesn't mean they just copied ours. It's just part of the culture, the general modern culture, to have a system of government that includes a constitution in many countries. And in the same way, they clearly just have different theological views about the flood. Just because you have this flood account and that flood account doesn't mean that one was stolen from each other. It seems to be part of the culture. It seems to be they're all kind of viewing this sort of the same event in their own theological ways and whatnot. So
I referred to I use the metaphor of the cultural river.
Yeah.
That there's a cultural river that has a lot of common elements that everybody knows about, and the idea of a massive cataclysmic flood is part of that cultural river. Everybody knows about it, but they all have their own interpretations of it.
Right, yeah, I do remember reading that in the book. Again, it was a really great book. Is there any other books you're working on you can tell us about, or is it all kind of private right now?
No, it's... So, as I mentioned, the revised edition of Ancient Near Eastern Thought is coming out next month. There's a book that I've been an editor for and contributor to called Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament, which is like 550 pages of giving lots of archaeological, historical, geographical, cultural information. That's coming out in November. I'm doing The Lost World of the Torah, and that's due out early in 2019. Also doing The Lost World, I'm sorry, not a Lost World book, also doing Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology. And that also is coming out early in 2019. Working on a Daniel commentary right now. So those are some of the things in process.
Awesome. I really enjoy reading your books. I highly encourage people to go out and get The Lost World of the Flood. It's just coming out today for anyone who didn't pre-order. It's on Amazon. It's on pretty much any. It will be on books right now, or is there any specific websites?
Yeah, it'll be everywhere.
Good, excellent, and please, everyone, check out more of John Walton's books. This is some of the. When I remember years ago, I had a lot of confusion with Genesis, and I've had numerous people recommend his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, and that changed the way I read Genesis pretty much ever since. And he's got so many other good books. He's got a great book I have here called The Survey of the Old Testament, his application commentary of Genesis. Ancient Near Eastern Thought on the Old Testament is a great book. Lost World of Genesis 1, Lost World of Adam and Eve, Lost World of Scripture, Lost World of the Canaanite Conquest. And so, I mean, plenty of good books out there. I highly recommend them. And also check out some books by Tremper Longman as well. He's got some great stuff on like the Song of Solomon and many other topics as well. So I highly encourage everyone to go out and get this book, The Lost World of the Flood, if you really want to start understanding the flood in its ancient Near Eastern context. Not from a modern Western understanding. We need to understand the biblical world or the biblical text in the culture they were written in. As Dr. Walton has said in a lot of lectures and in his books, the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. We have to understand the people that it was actually written to. So again, I highly encourage you to go out and get the book, The Lost World of the Flood. It's out today. And Dr. Walton, thanks for coming on today talking about the book. It's a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
All right. Take care, everybody. I'll see you next time.